5 Métis survivors came to his outpost, and Clay Beaumont's life was set on a new, unforgiving trail. 5 beautiful but exhausted Métis women, survivors of the territory's endless greed, would come begging for refuge from the law's shadow. Before starting this story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you are watching us from. My name is Clay Beaumont, and I've seen the sun set on more hope than a man should be allowed to carry. Late November of '88, the wind was already bringing the sharp edge of the high desert down the canyons earlier than usual. At the high ridges around the Cerro Blanco outpost, in the stark, unforgiving territory of Arizona, I'd already battened down the windows with oilcloth and stacked the last cords of mesquite wood. I never expected visitors, not anymore. The closest settlement, Dust Devil Springs, was a 2-day ride through unforgiving rock and sand. The last time I saw another 5 beautiful but exhausted Métis women, survivors of the territory's endless greed, would come begging for refuge from the law's shadow. Was when the stage came through a month prior, and the only thing they left was a trail of dust and a sense of profound emptiness that settled in the corners of my soul like the fine, red grit of the high plains. The outpost itself stood firm against the ridge, a scarred monument built by my own hands 10 years back, the year I decided to leave the company of men and keep only the company of my ghosts. I was 38 then. Before throwing in with this life, I'd been a soldier, a cavalryman, used to the strict rules of order and a sense of purpose that turned out to be as flimsy as a cheap saloon floor. I'd seen too much blood, too many broken promises, the kind that stain a man's memory and burn the last shreds of his decency. They called it progress, pushing the line westward, but all I witnessed was the slow, inevitable slaughter of everything honest, everything beautiful, and every woman I ever cared to hold. When I tried to speak up, to stand on the principles they taught me in the ranks: honor, duty, justice, no one wanted to listen. So I walked away. Since then, the silence of the Arizona scrub had been my only confessor, my only companion. That late afternoon, I was patching a crack in the watering trough behind the post's sun-bleached pine, cracked wide open by the relentless, baking heat of the day, now chilled by the approaching desert night. My hands were calloused beyond recognition, and the leather of my boots felt as old as the desert itself. But I worked with a steady rhythm, not for exercise, not to distract myself, but simply because the silence of the winter would be long, and the repairs would not make themselves. On the stove inside, a meager pot of jerky and beans boiled, the only scent of home I permitted myself. And then, the silence shifted. It wasn't the wind this time. The sound was even, measured. I paused, the hammer halfway through a strike, and strained my ears. Hoofbeats, one horse, tired, the sound muffled by the deep, red dust, but the rhythm was undeniable, a horse on its last leg, carrying a desperate burden. I circled the side of the post, my hand instinctively resting near the heavy Colt Peacemaker on my hip. I didn't draw it, not yet, but the readiness was a habit older than my solitude. As I rounded the corner, passing the low stone corral fence, I saw her, one woman, on one exhausted, sweat-lathered pinto mare, standing at the edge of the clearing between the brittle sagebrush and the low-slung, snow-dusted pines. She wasn't begging, she wasn't wailing, she was simply there. Charlene Hawk. I didn't know the name yet, but I knew the type. She was a ghost of this land, caught between two worlds. Her features were sharp, chiseled by the sun, and something harder, part indigenous, part something else, maybe the blood of a white rancher mixing with the ancient spirit of the Comanche or the Navajo. Her eyes, dark, wide, and unyielding, were fixed on me, a man she knew could either be her salvation or the final nail in her coffin. Her face was streaked with a mixture of sweat and the fine, rusty red dust of the desert, a beautiful, tragic mask. She dismounted with a tired grace, pulling the reins tight. Her clothing was simple, a faded canvas shirt and worn leather trousers, but her posture spoke of a pride that had been tested and battered, but was not yet broken. She didn't plead. She spoke directly, her voice dry, raspy, but the look in her eyes was like a hawk's, firm, focused, and ready to strike if threatened. "I need water for the mare, "And I need to buy supplies," she said, her voice a low murmur that barely cut through the wind. "Nothing more than that. I'll pay in coin." I didn't move. I saw the signs she didn't mention. The mare's flanks were heaving, a thin line of blood on its foreleg pushed too hard, too fast. And the woman herself? She held her left arm too stiffly, and beneath the dust-caked shirt, I could make out the faint, dark stain of a bruise rising on her jawline. She wasn't a traveler. She was a survivor on the run. I glanced toward the low hills behind her. Nothing stirred. No patrols, no riders. But I knew they were coming. They always did. I remembered the last time I let someone in a wounded trapper 3 years past. He drank my stores, stole my best horse, and left me tied up in the barn for a day and a half. But this wasn't a man. This was a woman alone, hurt, and carrying the burden of a past that the law in this territory rarely looked on kindly. She was of this land, but the law saw her only as property, or a problem, or a thing to be possessed. I saw in her eyes a flicker of the same desperation I'd seen in the eyes of the young women caught in the crossfire during my service, the kind of look that makes a man who still harbors a sliver of honor grit his teeth and remember what he gave up everything for. I opened the gate to the corral, not speaking a word. She led the horse in slowly, pausing only to look me up and down as she passed, measuring my size, my weapon, the depth of the emptiness in my eyes. I caught the faint smell of sweat, fear, and the wild, sharp scent of pine needles clinging to her clothes. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. It wasn't lust or even pity. It was a cold, hard rage against the universal injustice of the West, the same injustice that had robbed me of my own peace, my own family, and my faith in the flag I once swore to serve. Inside the small, low-ceilinged office of the outpost, the fire was burning low. I tossed on a fresh piece of mesquite, stirred the bean pot, and took a tin cup from the shelf. I filled it with coffee strong, black, and hot, and handed it to her. I offered the cup without comment. Survival is a shared language in the desert. The less said, the better. She settled herself on a low stool near the hearth, holding the cup with both hands, palms extended toward the heat. Her shirt was torn near the shoulder, the skin underneath taut and sun-darkened. She didn't hide the tear or the rising bruise on her collarbone. She looked at me, not with defiance, but with a simple, brutal acceptance of the world's cruelty. My gorge tightened again. Against whom had she earned this injury? Against what system? She drank slowly, silently, her eyes wide and exhausted, but never leaving my face. She hadn't come here for charity. She had come because there was nowhere else to go. After the coffee, I gave her a heavy canvas tarp and pointed toward the small, unused stable stall. I didn't ask her name, nor did I try to make conversation. That's not how you earn the trust of the hunted. I simply stepped away and sat by the window, my rifle across my knees, watching the darkness for any sign that someone had followed her. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away, and if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. The night was thick and cold, pressing against the thin glass of the window, and every shadow seemed to move with a predatory life of its own. I watched the darkness, the black expanse of the desert that had swallowed so many dreams and so many good people. In the blackness, I saw the face of my dead wife, Clara, her eyes mirroring the fear I had seen in this stranger's gaze just an hour before. "Oh, Clara, my sweet prairie flower, you deserved the gentlest death, a quiet passing, not the brutal, senseless end you met at the hands of men who called themselves law just because they wore a badge and carried a gun." Her face, once so vibrant and full of the promise of a life we would build together, was now just a fading, spectral memory that haunted the empty space next to me every damn night. I had failed her, then failed to protect her from the same corrupt rot that was chasing this young woman now. And the failure was a lead weight in my gut, a cancer on my soul that no amount of solitude or self-pity could burn out. The pain of losing Clara was not the sharp, agonizing cut of a fresh wound anymore. It was the dull, aching throb of a war wound that never truly heals, a constant reminder of my ultimate failure to honor my vows. That failure, that sense of deep, ingrained inadequacy, was the reason for my self-imposed exile. I was a man built to protect, who failed at the one thing that mattered. I was a monument to wasted valor. But now, this woman, Shaleen Hawk, the ghost with the fierce eyes, she was a chance. Not for redemption, not really. Redemption is for storybooks. She was a chance to finally, use the honor I still claimed to possess, to stand against the tide of injustice that had swept away my entire world. I sat there, the smell of burnt coffee and cheap kerosene filling my nostrils, listening to the quiet, even breaths coming from the stable stall. It wasn't fear I felt, not truly. It was something else entirely. Responsibility. It pressed on my chest, heavy and profound, like the weight of the snow on the roof in winter. And for the first time in years, the crushing loneliness was tempered by the presence of a single, desperate soul who needed the very thing I had left the world to avoid giving: protection. And I knew, with the certainty of a man facing his destiny, that I wouldn't turn her away, not for all the gold in the Arizona hills. To turn her away would be to finally admit that the man, Clay Beaumont, the soldier, the husband, the man of honor, was truly dead. And I wasn't ready to bury him yet. I was a broken man. Yes, but I was still a man. And the sight of her injustice was a raw, primal call to arms for the masculine spirit that the desert had tried to wither but failed to kill. The night passed slowly. I didn't sleep. Not fully. I watched the door, listened to the crackle of the mesquite logs, and tried not to think too much about the fact that a complete stranger was sleeping under my roof. And I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, hard clarity that I hadn't known since before Clara was taken. The frost outside was thick, but inside, a small, ember-like heat had begun to glow. It wasn't the warmth of a woman's touch, not yet. It was the heat of a purpose rediscovered, a fire lit beneath the cold, gray ash of my solitude. Morning arrived quiet and sharp. I was up before the sun cleared the eastern ridges, still sitting in the chair, my rifle across my lap, my neck stiff from sleeping upright in my dusty clothes. I listened first. Inside the stable stall, she was still there, the breathing steady, muffled by the canvas I'd given her. I put the rifle down and moved to the stove. I built the fire slowly, carefully, the old routine of a man used to the precision of silence. I added water to the pot. My hands moved without thought, a habit older than my fear, older than my grief. When the first light stained the rough-hewn planks of the post's main room, the stall door creaked open. Shaleen emerged. Her hair was loose, the dark, rich color falling over her shoulders. The faded shirt was still torn, the bruise on her jaw a deeper purple in the morning light. She didn't cover it. She observed me without shyness, without invitation, simply measuring my intent. I held her gaze and gave a brief, curt nod. She walked past me, grabbed a bucket near the back door without asking, and went outside toward the well. I could hear the grinding of the winch, the sounds of a woman working with intention. By the time she returned, the aroma of strong coffee filled the outpost. We ate the leftover beans and jerky. No complaints. Survival doesn't leave room for picky eating. After the meal, Shaleen went outside again, without a word. I watched her from the window. She was moving with purpose. She checked her mare, then started pulling weeds and clearing the dry brush around the corral fence. She wasn't an invited guest, she was a survivor. And survivors don't sit still. I went back to splitting mesquite, the heavy, sharp thwack of the axe against the wood a familiar, cleansing rhythm. Shaleen joined me a few minutes later. She didn't ask permission. She just started gathering the smaller, broken pieces of wood, stacking them neatly against the wall. She moved slowly, clearly in pain, but with a sheer, mule-headed stubbornness that I instantly recognized. It was the kind of grit that had carried me through the worst of the war and the worst of the silence afterward. Around noon, I sat at the rough-hewn table, cleaning my revolver, while she worked on the small garden plot outside, turning the hard, sun-baked earth. The questions piled up in my mind. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why now? I didn't speak them aloud, but in the late afternoon, Shaleen finally stood in the doorway, blocking the sun, and offered the first piece of her story. "I came from the Hawk Ranch, southwest of here," she said, her voice flat. "My father's land. The law took it." She looked me in the eye. "My white cousins decided a Métis woman shouldn't own land, even if it was earned. They hired a lawyer, Pike, and used the Abandoned Property Act. They got a court order. They came to haul me in." I remained silent, just studying her, the lines of fatigue around her mouth, the old scars on her wrists. She wasn't lying. The look of being cheated was too familiar for me to mistake it. "The ranch hands tried to keep me for themselves first," she continued, her voice dropping. "Then, when I fought, they called the marshal. They took the horses. All of them. My grandfather's prize Mustangs. I walked out with this mare and the clothes on my back. I slowly put down the cleaning cloth. 5 days in this desert, without supplies. I saw your smoke from the ridge," she finished. "I figured a lone man might be better than the alternatives, but I would have kept riding." "You guessed right," I finally replied. A minimal smile touched her lips, then vanished. "I won't stay long, just long enough to get back on my feet." To that, I didn't answer. I just got up and retrieved a coil of rope and a handful of nails from the supply chest. I laid them on the table. I didn't explain. I just left them there. That night, she had mended the main rope on the well. She had used the nails to secure a loose plank on the corral. I found myself on the porch, a cup of coffee in hand, watching her move around the post as if she had always belonged here. She never asked what I expected. She never waited for rules. Shalene passed by me on her way inside. Her hip grazed my knee. It wasn't an accident, but it wasn't a blatant invitation either. Our eyes met. "I know what men expect," she murmured. I didn't say anything. "I know what people will say if I stay too long." Still, I kept my silence. She studied my face, the scar by my eye, the stiffness in my shoulders. She seemed to nod, satisfied with whatever answer she found there, and turned away. I stayed by the window, the rifle across my legs, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was guarding an empty tomb. I felt like I was guarding something alive, something worth the watching, and I didn't send her away. The next morning, the expected visit arrived. A single rider, a tall man in a dust-caked suit, his face slick with sweat, rode into the clearing. He didn't wear a star, but the air around him was thick with the stink of cheap authority and self-importance. Behind him, a local deputy from Dust Devil Springs, fat and nervous, trailed along. Pike, the lawyer. He dismounted and swaggered toward the post. "Clay Beaumont, I assume," he said. "Not a question, just a pronouncement. I'm Attorney Pike, representing the Hawk estate. I understand you've sheltered a fugitive, Shalene Hawk." I stepped out onto the porch, letting the rifle rest casually against the railing. My stance was measured the old cavalry drill, unhurried, immovable. "You assume a lot, Pike. I run a stagecoach post. People come and go. I haven't seen any fugitives, only paying customers." Pike sneered, glancing toward the stable where Shalene was grooming her mare. "Don't play coy with me, Beaumont. That half-breed woman is a thief. Stole property from the rightful heirs and is resisting legal custody. You're aiding and abetting. That's a federal offense." It was the word thief, the word property, and the filthy word he used for her blood that broke the dam of my restraint. It was the same corrupt language that took Clara from me. "She paid for her coffee and board," I said, my voice low and level, the kind of tone that demanded attention precisely because it refused to rise. "She's currently employed here, doing the work no one else will touch, mending the fences, turning the soil. She's a necessary hand, attorney. And I've registered her as my personal attendant with the territorial office." Pike's eyes narrowed. "An attendant? I have a warrant for her arrest." He produced a crumpled paper. "Warrants are for fugitives. She's an employee, and if she's gone, I'm out of a worker, and you can explain to the stage line why the post is closed, and why you're personally responsible for the delay of federal mail." I used the law, the system they respected, as a shield, a move they hadn't expected from a lone drifter. Shalene emerged from the stable, a horsebrush in her hand. She stood next to me, a silent, defiant presence. "This is an outrage," Pike sputtered. "That woman belongs in a proper place, under proper authority." "Her authority is here," I said, my hand resting on her shoulder, a gesture that was more about possession than affection, a declaration of ownership to the outside world, but a contract of partnership between us. "She's my wife-to-be, attorney. You interrupt my domestic life, and I'll have you cited for harassment. You want her? You file papers with the territorial judge in Prescott. Until then, you get off my land. Now." Pike was visibly shaking, caught between his authority and the fear of tangling with a stone-faced armed man in a remote post. He knew the law, but he didn't know the territory, and I was the territory's law out here. He glared at Shaleen, who simply returned the look with a calm, unnerving stoicism. "This isn't over, Beaumont. You just bought yourself a heap of trouble." "I buy and sell trouble all the time, Pike," I replied, the lie passing my lips with practiced ease. "It's how I earn my keep. Now, get on your horse." He did. He and the nervous deputy rode away in a cloud of red dust, defeated by a bluff and a hard stare. Shaleen and I stood there long after the sound of their horses faded. She finally spoke, her voice still quiet. "Wife-to-be? Attendant? You didn't have to lie for me, Clay." "I didn't lie for you," I said, turning to face her. "I lied for the principle of the thing. They used a flimsy law to take what was yours. I used a flimsy lie to keep them off my land. We're even. You're here, you work, you stay out of trouble. In return, I'm your protection. That's the contract." "A contract with a price," she murmured, her dark eyes searching mine. "The price is your silence and your labor." "And your honesty," I stated. "The masculine need for control and clear boundaries overriding everything else. I've been betrayed enough. We're partners in this, Shale. Don't make me regret the lie." She didn't smile, but her eyes held a spark of deep, profound gratitude and something else, respect. She was a woman who valued honesty over flattery, and my gruff demand for truth seemed to have impressed her more than any soft word. "My name is Shaleen," she corrected, giving me her full name, a sign of her own honesty. "And I don't break my word, Clay. The work is done when I say it's done, and I won't run. Not from them, and not from you." The weight of the lie settled heavy on my shoulders, but for the first time since Clara's passing, the burden felt necessary. It felt right. I wasn't guarding ghosts anymore. I was defending the living. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The following days were spent in a tense, watchful quiet. The sun, a brutal hammer in the Arizona sky, beat down on the Cerro Blanco outpost. Every chore felt like a preparation for a siege. I watched the ridges. Shaleen watched the trail. We didn't talk much, but the shared silence became a new kind of intimacy, a silent testament to our shared defiance. I was fixing the main support beam in the barn when I heard the low, distressed whinny. Old Samson, my last remaining horse, a battered, loyal animal that had carried me through the war, was down in the far corner of the corral. He'd been struggling with a bad leg for months, a legacy of a reckless scouting mission. The leg had finally given out. I rushed over, my gut sinking. Samson was all I had left of my past life, a living memory of the man I used to be. To lose him was to lose another piece of myself. "Get the rifle," I ordered Shaleen, who had appeared instantly, her eyes already assessing the situation. "It's a clean shot. He can't suffer." "Wait, Clay." Her voice was sharp, cutting through my despair. She knelt by the horse, ignoring the flailing hooves and the sheer size of the animal. She ran her hands, dark and surprisingly delicate, over the horse's swollen foreleg, touching the old injury. "It's not broken, not exactly. It's the old tendon tear. He needs to be off his feet, and the joint needs to be set and tightly wrapped. The bone is fine, but the damage is deep." I stared at her, then at the rifle in my hand. "You think you can fix this?" "I am the granddaughter of the finest horse shaman in the Comancheria, and the daughter of a man who bred champions," she replied, her voice filled with a quiet, unshakable pride. I know horses, Clay. I know this land. And I know how to mend what is broken. I won't let him die, not yet. She spent the entire day with Samson. She brewed a potent, bitter tea of desert herbs that smelled of earth and smoke, forcing the horse to drink. She used smooth, flat stones heated by the sun and then cooled in water to massage the area. She took the canvas I had given her, tore it into long strips, and wrapped the leg with the precision of a surgeon. I watched her, mesmerized. This wasn't just labor, it was a connection. She wasn't just an attendant or a desperate fugitive. She was a master of this harsh, beautiful ecosystem. The sheer utility of her presence, the fact that she saved the one thing I held most dear, dwarfed any threat from Pike or any debt she owed me. She had found her value here, not as my dependent, but as my equal. Samson was on his feet by evening, wobbly but alive. "You saved him," I said, the words tasting like copper in my dry mouth. Shalene leaned against the dusty corral, exhausted but satisfied. "We save what we can, Clay. That's what survivors do." But the reprieve was short-lived. The next morning, a frightened stage driver stumbled into the outpost, his face pale, his hands bound with rough twine. "They got him, Clay. Pike and 3 of his men. They grabbed Old Man Peters, the passenger. They're holding him at the ruins in the canyon. Said they'll break his hands unless you deliver the woman to them by sundown." The game had changed. Pike wasn't just after land, he was after my honor. He had dragged an innocent man into our private war. I immediately armed myself, loading my rifle and checking my Colt. The old soldier in me was instantly awake, clear, cold, and focused. "Stay here," I commanded Shalene. "I'm riding alone. If I'm not back by dawn, you take Samson and ride north. Don't look back." Shalene grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "No, you ride in there alone. You're dead, or you'll lose your honor handing me over. They want me. I'm the bait. But you need to win, not sacrifice yourself." "This is my fight, Shalene. You stay out of it." "This is our fight, you fool," she hissed, the first time she had ever raised her voice. "They are using the law to take my land, and they are using their power to threaten the innocent. You are doing this for justice, not for me. And justice needs 2 hands." She was right. The sheer force of her argument, the appeal to the principle I was fighting for, not the person, shattered my masculine need for lone sacrifice. "Fine," I conceded. "You ride 10 minutes behind me. Stay out of sight. When you hear the first shot, you flank them on the east ridge. Create a distraction, nothing more." I rode hard, the heat of the day blurring the edges of the canyon walls. I found them at the old mission ruins. Pike and 3 hard-looking thugs, holding poor man Peters with a knife to his throat. "I'm here, Pike," I called out, dismounting slowly. "Let the man go." "Where's the girl, Beaumont?" Pike yelled. "She's the price. The land is nothing. I want her brought to justice." "She's not here," I lied. "I'm all you get." Pike laughed, a high, nervous sound. "Then you get a bullet, you fool, and we'll take the old man's money and ride back to your outpost to claim the girl after we bury you." The ensuing fight was a brutal, chaotic blur of dust, sweat, and muzzle flash. I took the first shot, aimed not to kill but to disable the thug holding the knife. Peters went down, crawling for cover. I was outflanked, 2 men shooting at me from either side. I felt the sharp whiz of a bullet passing too close to my ear. And then, the distraction. A sudden, sharp cry of a hawk echoed from the eastern ridge, followed by 3 quick, well-placed rifle shots. Not hitting, but sending dust and pebbles flying near Pike's head. Shalene. She had used the moment to assert her partnership. The men's attention fractured. Pike cursed, turning his rifle toward the ridge. That was the opening I needed. I sprinted to cover, reloaded, and took down the closest thug with a precise shot to the leg. The fight ended minutes later. Pike, his face a mask of impotent rage, scrambled onto his horse and rode off, leaving his injured man behind. He screamed a promise of revenge that was lost in the wind. The remaining thug dropped his weapon and ran. I checked on Peters, shaken, but unharmed. Then I looked toward the ridge. Shalene descended, her rifle still warm in her hands. "You didn't stay out of sight," I said, my voice hoarse, a strange mix of fury and relief. "You told me to create a distraction." "I did," she countered, her own breathing ragged. I needed you alive, Clay. I need this contract to hold. I walked toward her, the dust of the fight still settling. I took the rifle from her hands, leaned them both against a ruined wall, and cupped her face in my dirt-caked palm. You are the most stubborn, foolhardy woman I have ever met, I whispered. And then I kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of two survivors who had just faced death together, a violent, desperate affirmation of life. Her mouth was hot and tasted of dust and adrenaline. She didn't pull away. She met my force with her own, her arms wrapping around my neck, holding me as if I were the anchor that would keep her from drowning in the inevitable current of the West. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke. The partnership was no longer just about survival and legality. It was about the sheer, undeniable reality of two broken people finding a necessary, powerful connection in the ruins of their former lives. The contract was sealed, not in paper, but in blood and dust, and the shared breath of defiance. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. The air at the Cerro Blanco outpost settled, but it was the calm before the coming storm. Pike had been routed, humiliated, but not defeated. A man like that, who trades in the currency of perceived authority and greed, doesn't disappear just because of a few well-aimed shots. He goes back to his ledgers and his corrupt friends, and he finds a bigger gun. In the small, mean territory of Dust Devil Springs, Pike was just a lawyer, but I knew his kind had connections in Prescott, maybe even to the governor's men, the kind of corruption that could swallow a small outpost whole. Shalene and I fell into a rhythm that night, a silent, knowing choreography of two people irrevocably bound. We sat by the fire, mending our wounds. She cleaned the gash on my arm. I applied salve to the deep bruise on her shoulder. The physical closeness was a quiet, profound comfort, no need for grand declarations, only the steady, firm presence of another soul. The unspoken closeness led us to my bed later that night. It was an act of two veterans, recognizing the desperate need for warmth and connection in a world that offered none. It wasn't rushed or shy. It was an act of shared release, of two worn-out bodies, finding solace in the one place they could truly be vulnerable without fear of betrayal. When it was over, I didn't hold her just for comfort. I held her because I finally felt the weight of my past life lift, replaced by the weight of her living presence. But the morning brought the stark light of reality. We were still just two people against a system. 3 days later, the official summons arrived. A rider, a neutral party from Dust Devil Springs, delivered it. The territorial court had reviewed Pike's petition, and it was now demanding Shalene Hawk's formal presence in court to answer charges of grand larceny and resisting arrest. Furthermore, the court was questioning my false claims of an impending marriage and my misrepresentation of her status as an employee, demanding proof of intent to marry or face penalties for obstruction of justice. I read the paper, the dry, formal legal language dripping with Pike's spite. They were forcing my hand. The lie I told to save her life was now the legal noose tightening around her neck. They won't stop, I said, crumpling the paper. They want the land, but they want the satisfaction of breaking you more, Shalene. This is about principle now, not profit. Shalene looked at the summons with a calm that unnerved me. If I go to Dust Devil Springs, they'll have a rope waiting, Clay. Or they'll just marry me off to one of Pike's thugs to gain legal control of my assets. We run, I stated, the options sudden and clear. We take Samson, stock up on supplies, and head for California. We can disappear into the Sierra Nevada. Shalene shook her head slowly. No. Running is what they expect. Running is what confirms their claims. I will not give them the satisfaction of proving I am a thief. I am not a thief. I am the rightful heir. The weight of her honor was heavier than the instinct to survive. It was the moment of ultimate choice, my peace or her dignity. My mind, the mind of a soldier, a man trained to follow orders and calculate odds, wrestled with the decision. I had sought peace for years, sacrificed everything for my solitude. To fight this meant sacrificing that peace, making myself a permanent target, and giving up the dream of quiet retirement. But looking into her eyes, the same fierce, unwavering gaze that had saved Samson, that had flanked me in the canyon, I knew my solitude had been a lie. I was a man of utility, and my utility lay in her defense. "There is one way," I said, my voice low and determined. "The court demands proof of intent to marry, or penalties for misrepresentation. I'll give them the proof." Shalene stared at me, understanding dawning in her eyes. "A marriage of convenience?" "No," I corrected, walking over and taking her hands in mine. "A marriage of necessity. I'm not doing this for the law, Shalene. I'm doing it because I made a vow to myself to never fail to protect the innocent again. I'm doing it for Clara's memory, for my own honor, and because I cannot lose you to the injustice of this territory." "You would sacrifice your peace for my freedom," she whispered. "My peace died a long time ago," I replied. "But my honor is all I have left, and you, Shalene Hawk, are now a part of it." The next day, we rode to Dust Devil Spring. We rode openly, our heads held high, no attempt to sneak around. Shalene wore her best, faded buckskin tunic, and I wore my cavalry coat, the one I hadn't touched since I left the service. The town was small, mean, and dusty. We went directly to the justice of the peace. Pike, who was waiting in the saloon, rushed in, shocked and furious. "This is a farce," Pike yelled, brandishing the court summons. "This is obstruction. This is coercion." I handed the JP the proper paperwork, the original land deed copy I'd had on file, and the formal declaration. "We are here, by court order, to prove intent," I stated, my voice echoing with the authority of a man who was no longer merely a drifter, but a man defending his family. "Here is the proof of intent, Justice. We are married. Now." The justice of the peace, a wizened, weary man named Mr. Evans, looked from the furious Pike to the calm, implacable Shalene, then to me, my hand resting firmly on the butt of my Colt. He cleared his throat. Under territorial law, a verbal declaration, witnessed by two parties, constitutes a legal marriage if filed immediately. Tilly, the saloon owner, and Jonah, the blacksmith, stepped forward to witness the vow. "Do you, Clay Beaumont, take this woman?" "I do," I affirmed, the two simple words carrying more weight than any oath I'd ever sworn. "And do you, Shalene Hawk, take this man?" "I do," she replied, her voice steady, not a flicker of hesitation. She was marrying the contract, yes, but she was also marrying the man who had laid his solitude on the line for her. Pike raged, but the law had been satisfied. The JP, nervous but correct, stamped the marriage certificate. "You've ruined yourself, Beaumont," Pike shouted as we walked out of the office. "You're tied to this land, this woman, and the trouble that follows her. You've made yourself a target." I didn't turn around. I simply held Shalene's hand, our dust-covered boots kicking up the dry street grit. "He's right," she whispered. "You are now fully exposed." "My protection is my choice, Shalene," I replied, squeezing her hand. "I choose to protect you, and from this day forward, any threat against you is a threat against my name, my property, and my life. Let him come. I'll be ready." We rode back to the Cerro Blanco outpost, not as a drifter and a fugitive, but as husband and wife. The air was heavy, the burden immense, but the sense of purpose, of having finally used my strength and my name for a righteous cause, was an antidote to all the years of self-loathing. I was no longer just Clay Beaumont, the failed soldier. I was Clay Beaumont, a man who chose honor over comfort and love over peace. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The cold deepened, bringing a relentless winter storm that tested the limits of the outpost. The wind howled like a banshee through the canyons, finding every crack in the brittle pine walls, rattling the oilcloth over the windows, until I thought the thin glass would shatter. We huddled by the stove for days, rationing the mesquite. One night, a fierce gust tore a section of tarp from the stable roof. I went out alone in the whiteout, cursing and freezing. Shalene's face pale with worry as she watched from the door. The sheer ferocity of the desert winter was a character unto itself, a grinding, unyielding